Hello, my name's Lawrence Teasey and I'm president of Erba Molecular.
How does Erba Mannheim's second-generation test meet the current and future criteria of laboratories?
Well, the main criteria of a test, of course, is that it's accurate. We've gone to great lengths to make sure this test is highly sensitive and highly specific. The future criteria for tests has to take into account the throughput of the laboratories. So our test is very easy to use and it's very easy to do high numbers of tests in a day. In addition to that, we've made the test room temperature stable. So you don't have to store it at -20, and it makes your supply much safer because you're now not relying on cold storage in your transportation plan.
Seeing that this is a second-generation test, what makes this test different from first-generation tests?
The first-generation tests that come out were obviously put out very quickly, and since then there's been time to optimize those tests so that they are more sensitive and more specific. So therefore it is a second-generation test with better performance.
What was important about the way the Erba Mannheim PCR test was developed?
The Erba Mannheim PCR test followed a rigid product development process here. And that means that you, from day one, look at the user requirements and the clinical requirements of your assay, and you try to think what the customer needs. And that's why, for example, we went to having the test in a freeze-dried format, so that as a company we could transport this all around the world with confidence. We also had to take into consideration that the SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus which will mutate. So we wanted to make sure we had a backup within our test so that any single mutation would not knock the test out. In addition to that, we recognised that many people are new to doing molecular assays in the labs. So we wanted it to be as simple as possible, so as few steps in the process as possible. And finally, we recognise that there's lots of labs around the world who have PCR machines and sample preparation methods, but they haven't got a specific test for them. So we wanted to make sure our test could work on almost any single machine.
While people are waiting for a vaccine, what are your recommendations when people find themselves feeling ill and showing signs of COVID?
If you have signs of COVID, or even if you have been exposed to someone with signs of COVID, the value of a PCR test is that it can pick up active disease far earlier than any other method. So by using PCR and screening people, even pre-symptomatically, you've got a better chance of catching people who then go on to become infectious.
What is the benefit of PCR tests compared to rapid antigen tests and antibody tests?
PCR tests are more sensitive and specific for active disease than antigen tests or antibody tests, and that's their main benefit.
Why should people be looking to get the Erba Mannheim PCR test?
The Erba Mannheim PCR test has been well designed. We spent a lot of time thinking, what do the users need? What are the limiting factors? And what are the risk factors involved? So we've followed well-documented design processes to come up with a product that's going to have longevity and give performance to the users. So this covers a number of aspects. It's an extremely sensitive assay. We have one of the lowest limits of detections of any of the PCR assays out there. We have robustness in there because we're targeting two separate, very well characterized genes, so we can be very confident that new mutations are not going to affect the assay because we have a second chance in there by having two genes in there. We have the test completely out of the cold chain. It's freeze-dried, so you can store it at room temperature, you can transport it at room temperature. And finally, we have a very simple workflow, simple reconstitution and use on almost any PCR machine and any sample preparation. So you have huge versatility. So any laboratory could use our assay.
What makes Erba Mannheim's assay design stand out? And how does it affect the laboratory's day-to-day work?
So the Erba test design is designed for confidence. We have put in two separate gene targets which are very well characterized. People know their sequences, so people can be confident that the results they get are accurate. The other aspects of the design is the ease of use, so that it's very easy to operate, simple reconstitution, and then directly onto almost any type of PCR machine.
How easy to use and how versatile is the new Erba PCR test?
The Erba PCR test is incredibly easy to use. We have one pot of freeze-dried reagent, you rehydrate it, and you're ready to go. Many PCR tests will have a whole collection of tubes you have to precisely pipette together to get your mix. So we have none of that. And that reduces the chance of errors, which increases the likelihood that you'll get accurate results. So that's a really important facet. We've also made it really flexible. You can run this almost on any PCR machine. And indeed, it's compatible with the vast majority of sample preparation methods. So this means almost regardless of the hardware you have in your lab, you can use the Erba Mannheim PCR COVID test.
With a test like PCR, what does the low limit of detection mean to the performance of the test?
PCR has one of the lowest limits of detection of any detection system. This is vital for COVID-19 for a few reasons. First of all, people may not even have symptoms initially, and only a very sensitive test can pick up that they are infected. So COVID-19 can be detected with PCR before you even have symptoms. Secondly, the nature of the samples, often throat swabs, nose swabs, is very irreproducible. So you need a sensitive test to make up for the fact that sometimes people don't sample properly. So both those things are extremely important. Going forward, when we need to be doing mass screening of people, it would be great to be able to pull samples together as well, like they do in blood banking. This will reduce the cost of screening very many people as well. And you can only do that if you have a very low limit of detection.
With a test like PCR, what does the low limit of detection mean to the performance of the test?
The limit of detection of PCR is the best of all assays out there. And this means that you can detect diseases that you'd miss with other tests. And this is a critical factor against COVID-19 in particular. Our second generation test has actually improved the sensitivity compared to some of the first generation tests still further for PCR. And this means that we will be less likely to miss people who are carrying disease.
What is the benefit of having a single tube assay?
When you have a PCR test in a single tube, all your controls and all your targets, in a typical PCR machine, it will have 96 spaces for tubes. So that means in principle you can do 96 assays. And that's 96 people. Some PCR tests you have to use 2 tubes. So that now means in one run you can only do 48 samples. So your throughput improves if you can do it all in one tube.
Why is high throughput important?
High throughput is important because we want to be mass screening people. And this may be for example, you may want to screen people getting on a cruise ship, getting on an aeroplane. You may want to screen your workforce. You may want to screen a prison. We're going to see more and more of this. And so the more people you can do and the more affordable it is to do high numbers of people, the better.
PCR tests are shipped globally, and that is a huge logistical challenge. How does the Erba PCR test kit fare when being shipped globally? How do you preserve the bioactivity and longevity of the product?
So Erba Mannheim is a global company, and we have to think about serving our clients all over the world. And that's a huge challenge for PCR tests. The majority of PCR tests, they have to be stored and transported at minus 20 degrees centigrade. That means lots of dry ice flying around the world. We recognise that to serve our customers globally, that we need to get out of a minus 20 cold chain. And we've done that by having freeze-dried assays. In addition to that, our customers have to store the assays somewhere. And minus 20 cold space is precious. So we can now have our tests stored in a cupboard. And that's extremely valuable for our customers.
What attributes does Erba Mannheim have as a company that make it competitive with other molecular diagnostic companies?
Erba Molecular has a fantastic team, and that's one of our key attributes here. The Cambridge area is rich in really great scientists, so we've been able to recruit some really amazing people here. In addition to that, they bring experience, and that experience allows us to develop products thinking about the end user in mind, something that many more naive companies forget. And finally, process. We follow clearly defined design processes here, so that what we produce is professionally documented and trustworthy.
In summary, why should people use the Erba Mannheim PCR test?
The Erba Mannheim PCR test has tried to combine a number of features that we know is useful to the users and also useful to the patients who are going to have the test. So we have worked to have an extremely high sensitive test and also a test that's robust to any emerging mutations that may occur in COVID-19. Secondly, we have got the test out of the cold chain. So you no longer have to transport this at -20 or store it at -20. And that makes the whole supply of this test so much more reliable and safe. Thirdly, we've made the assay extremely simple to use. It's a very simple format to use, and also you can use it on many different PCR machines and many different sample preparation methods. So it's got huge potential for almost any lab to want to use. And finally, in the future, we see this assay as being future-proof, because not only can you store it for a long time, the sensitivity could even allow for future pooling strategies like we have presently in blood banking. As the pandemic sort of spreads out and the numbers reduce, we may still need to do lots of mass testing, and it's a perfect assay for that.
What is in the Erba Mannheim PCR test kit?
The Erba Mannheim test kit is deceptively simple. Here we have a single master mix, which contains everything you need to detect 2 separate genes in SARS-CoV-2, as well as a control to make sure people have sampled themselves properly. And this is simply rehydrated with a buffer we supply, and that's it. We also supply a positive control, which is required, and we take the care to package that in foil so that there's no chance of contaminating the kit.